In 2025, courtrooms across Italy and beyond have become stages for the Mafia's biggest names. From Francesco Bidognetti threatening journalists mid-hearing to Salvatore Russo facing drug trafficking charges, these trials reveal that even under oath, these bosses are still running rackets, rebuilding, and blatantly defying the law. Francesco Bidognetti. Bidognetti was a very powerful man. This guy was running the show for the Casalesi clan, which is basically one of the most brutal and powerful groups within the Camorra. And if you don't know what the Camorra is, think of it as the Sicilian Mafia's equally violent cousin from Naples. The Casalesi clan, under Bidognetti's leadership, was like a parallel government. They had their hands in construction companies, waste management, basically anything that made money in their territory. They either controlled it or got a cut from it. And we're not talking about small-time operations here. This was a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise that employed hundreds of people and influenced local politics in ways that most people couldn't even imagine. But even though Bidognetti was already serving life in prison, he apparently couldn't resist the urge to keep throwing his weight around. Back in 2008, during what should have been just another routine court appearance, this guy decided to use his lawyer as a messenger service to deliver threats to two people who had been causing problems for the Camorra. The targets? Roberto Saviano, the guy who wrote Gomorrah, that book that absolutely destroyed any romantic notions people might have had about organized crime, and Rosaria Capacchione, a journalist who had spent years documenting exactly how these criminal organizations operated. Both of these people had basically made careers out of exposing the Camorra's dirty laundry, and apparently Bidognetti was not happy about it. So what does he do? He gets his lawyer to stand up in court and read out what was essentially a hit list. Not subtle threats or vague intimidation. We're talking about explicit statements designed to make these two people fear for their lives. And remember, this is happening in a courtroom, supposedly one of the most secure and justice-oriented spaces in society. The audacity was just incredible. For 17 years, this threat just hung out there in the legal system like some kind of unfinished business. Prosecutors knew what had happened, but building a case for intimidation isn't as straightforward as you might think. They had to prove intent, demonstrate that the threats were credible, and navigate all sorts of complex legal frameworks about what constitutes prosecutable intimidation versus just angry rhetoric. But justice moves slowly sometimes, and on July 14th, 2025, Bidognetti finally got his comeuppance. A Rome appeals court convicted him of intimidation and slapped him with an 18-month sentence. Now, 18 months might not sound like much when the guy's already serving life, but symbolically, this was huge. It basically said that even the most powerful criminals can't use the legal system as their personal intimidation platform. The conviction was way more significant than the actual sentence suggests. For Saviano and Capacchione, who had been living under the shadow of these threats for nearly 2 decades, it probably felt like a small measure of justice finally being served. Next up is the mastermind behind a global criminal empire, one so vast and sophisticated, its reach rivals that of the world's most powerful corporations. Salvatore Russo. This is Salvatore Russo. He was a boss in the 'Ndrangheta, specifically running the Russo clan. And if you're not familiar with the 'Ndrangheta, let me break it down for you. While the Sicilian Cosa Nostra gets most of the attention in movies and books, the 'Ndrangheta from Calabria has quietly become probably the most powerful and wealthy criminal organization in the world. These guys have basically taken over the global cocaine trade. The 'Ndrangheta's structure is absolutely fascinating and terrifying at the same time. Unlike other organized crime groups that are based on geography or neighborhoods, the 'Ndrangheta is built around family bloodlines. And I mean actual family, not just criminal associates. This makes them incredibly difficult to penetrate with informants because you literally have to be born into these organizations to reach positions of real authority. Russo's role in managing cocaine imports represents the kind of sophisticated international operation that modern organized crime requires. We're not talking about small-time drug dealing on street corners. This is about coordinating shipments worth millions of dollars, managing relationships with South American cartels, and maintaining distribution networks that span multiple continents. The scale of the cocaine trade that the 'Ndrangheta controls is absolutely mind-blowing. European authorities estimate that these organizations control somewhere around 80% of the cocaine that enters Europe, which represents billions of dollars in annual revenue. That kind of money creates corruption opportunities and political influence that can reach the highest levels of government and business. But Russo wasn't just involved in drug trafficking. He was also allegedly running traditional extortion schemes in Calabria, which shows how these organizations maintain their territorial control while also operating on a global scale. The extortion rackets provide steady income and local political influence, while the international drug operations generate the massive profits that fund expansion and corruption. The fact that Russo was leveraging the 'Ndrangheta's global reach in his operations demonstrates just how sophisticated these criminal enterprises have become. They have established relationships with criminal organizations in South America, Africa, Africa, Australia, and North America that allow them to coordinate activities across multiple time zones and legal jurisdictions. The charges that Russo faces in 2025, Mafia association, drug trafficking, and extortion, represent the full spectrum of modern organized crime activities. These aren't separate criminal enterprises, but integrated operations where local territorial control supports international criminal activities and global profits fund local power and influence. The ongoing trials involving Russo are part of broader international efforts to combat the 'Ndrangheta's expansion, but the challenges are enormous. These organizations have the resources to hire the best lawyers, corrupt officials at multiple levels, and maintain operational security that makes traditional law enforcement techniques much less effective or completely ineffective. Next up on our list was a guy who got arrested back in 2021, somehow managed to get released before 2025, and then apparently went right back to doing exactly what got him arrested in the first place. Quite an interesting case. Giuseppe Calvaruso. To understand Giuseppe's story, you first have to understand the Pagliarelli clan, a Cosa Nostra family that shows just how deeply the Mafia is woven into Sicilian life. Their roots stretch back generations, and their influence seeps into legitimate society in ways that make them almost impossible to eradicate. Giuseppe was arrested in 2021 on drug trafficking charges, but according to prosecutors, Calvaruso wasted no time after his release, diving straight back into extortion and drug trafficking, and even taking part in the reorganization of the Pagliarelli clan. Sadly, this swift return to crime is all too common in these circles. The fact that he was allegedly aiding in Mafia reorganization efforts makes his case particularly significant from a law enforcement perspective. Extortion remains one of the core activities that allows these organizations to maintain territorial control and generate steady revenue streams. The protection rackets that have plagued Sicilian businesses for generations create a parallel tax system that enriches criminal organizations while undermining legitimate economic development and discouraging entrepreneurship. The drug trafficking aspects of Calvaruso's alleged activities represent the global dimensions of modern organized crime. Sicilian crime families have historically served as crucial intermediaries in international drug networks, using their strategic location and sophisticated smuggling infrastructure to facilitate the movement of narcotics from production areas to consumer markets throughout Europe. On February 11, 2025, Calvaruso was swept up in those coordinated Palermo raids that targeted multiple figures involved in the alleged Mafia reorganization efforts. His arrest was part of a broader law enforcement strategy designed to prevent these criminal organizations from fully reconstituting their traditional power structures. The charges he faces include Mafia association and extortion. Now, this might sound relatively straightforward, but they are super important activities that allow these organizations to maintain power and generate revenue. Mafia association charges are particularly important because they recognize that participation in these organizations is inherently criminal, regardless of whether individuals can be connected to specific violent acts. Up next, we have Tommaso Lo Presti. Lo Presti is old-school Cosa Nostra through and through, a boss in the Porta Nuova clan, which, if you know anything about Sicilian organized crime history, is basically royalty. The Porta Nuova clan isn't just any crime family. These guys have been major players in Palermo for generations, and they've traditionally had a seat at the big table, the cupola, which is basically the governing body that coordinates between different Cosa Nostra families and keeps them from killing each other off in stupid turf wars. Lo Presti had been in prison, which in the organized crime world is kind of like going to graduate school. You spend your time networking with other criminals, learning from your mistakes, and planning for what you're going to do when you get out. And apparently, what Lo Presti wanted to do was get the old gang back together and rebuild the cupola. The timing of his release was probably law enforcement's worst nightmare. Italian authorities had spent decades systematically dismantling Cosa Nostra's traditional power structures. They'd locked up leaders, seized assets, broken up criminal networks, and basically done everything possible to destroy these organizations. But here's the thing about criminal enterprises that have been operating for over a century: they're incredibly resilient. According to prosecutors, Lo Presti didn't waste any time once he got out of prison. He allegedly started coordinating efforts to rebuild the cupola, which would have essentially meant reconstituting the governing structure of Sicilian organized crime. This isn't just about one guy starting a new criminal operation. This is about potentially reviving an institutional framework that had taken law enforcement decades to destroy. The charges against Lo Presti, extortion and drug trafficking, might sound routine, but they represent the bread and butter of of how these organizations maintain power and generate revenue. Extortion isn't just about demanding money from local businesses. It's about creating a parallel tax system that allows criminal organizations to control territory and maintain authority over legitimate economic activity. Drug trafficking, meanwhile, represents the global reach of modern organized crime. Sicilian crime families have historically served as crucial middlemen in international drug networks, using their strategic location in the Mediterranean and their centuries of smuggling expertise to move narcotics from production areas to consumer markets throughout Europe and beyond. The investigation that led to Lo Presti's arrest was probably years in the making. Modern anti-mafia operations are incredibly sophisticated, involving everything from financial investigations to electronic surveillance to carefully cultivated informants within criminal organizations. The fact that they moved against him relatively quickly after his release suggests they were watching him from the moment he got out of prison. The raid throughout Palermo basically sent shockwaves through whatever was left of Sicily's criminal underworld. Lo Presti's arrest was part of a broader operation that demonstrated law enforcement's continued commitment to preventing Cosa Nostra's resurgence, but it also showed just how quickly these organizations can attempt to rebuild when given the opportunity. The charges he's facing, mafia association, extortion, and racketeering, represent the full spectrum of traditional organized crime activities. Mafia association is a particularly interesting charge because it recognizes that just being part of these organizations is criminal in itself, regardless of whether you can be connected to specific violent acts. Now let's move on to one of the saddest cases in this list. Ralph DeLeo. Ralph DeLeo's story is honestly one of the saddest and most pathetic things on this entire list. And I don't say that to be mean. I say it because here's an 82-year-old man who apparently couldn't let go of a grudge and made decisions that could literally end his life in federal prison. DeLeo was a former street boss in the Colombo crime family, which, if you know anything about New York organized crime, has been an absolute disaster for decades. This family has been through more internal wars, federal prosecutions, and leadership turnovers than any sane criminal enterprise should be able to survive. By the time DeLeo was in a position of authority, the Colombos were already a shadow of what they'd been during their heyday. The guy had already been convicted of racketeering, which in the federal system is basically a career-ending prosecution. RICO cases don't just target individual crimes, they go after entire criminal enterprises, and they carry penalties that can effectively eliminate someone's ability to continue in organized crime. For someone like DeLeo, who had probably spent his entire adult life in this world, a RICO conviction wasn't just a legal consequence, it was a professional humiliation. But here's where the story gets really crazy. Instead of accepting his conviction and trying to live out his remaining years quietly, DeLeo allegedly decided to plot revenge against the law enforcement officials who had been involved in his prosecution. We're talking about federal prosecutors, FBI agents, people who were literally just doing their jobs by investigating and prosecuting organized crime. The psychology behind this alleged plot is fascinating and terrifying at the same time. At 82 years old, what exactly did DeLeo think he was going to accomplish by murdering law enforcement officials? The practical benefits would have been essentially zero, while the potential consequences, including additional life sentences and guaranteed death in federal prison, were catastrophic. The investigation that led to his arrest in May 2025 probably involved some seriously sophisticated law enforcement techniques. When you're talking about potential plots against federal officials, agencies don't mess around. They throw every resource they have at these cases, including surveillance, wiretaps, and probably informant intelligence from other criminals who weren't interested in being associated with such a monumentally stupid plan. The charges DeLeo is facing, conspiracy to commit murder and possibly additional racketeering violations, are the kind of federal prosecutions that basically guarantee you'll die in prison. Conspiracy charges are particularly powerful because prosecutors don't need to prove that the planned murders actually happened. They just need to show that substantial steps were taken toward planning and implementing them. DeLeo's alleged planning wasn't based on any kind of rational cost-benefit analysis. Instead, it seems to have been driven by wounded pride, adherence to some kind of twisted criminal code that demands retaliation, and maybe just an inability to accept that the world had changed and that his way of life was effectively over. Up next, Johnny Martinez. As a reputed boss in the Orange County Mexican Mafia, Martinez was allegedly running operations in one of the most affluent and strategically located regions of Southern California. The Mexican Mafia, despite what the name suggests, is actually an American criminal organization that got its start in the California prison system. Unlike traditional crime families that developed along neighborhood and ethnic lines, La M, as it's also known, evolved within correctional institutions, where survival and power dynamics create very different organizational structures and loyalty systems. Martinez's alleged role as an Orange County boss shows just how sophisticated and geographically diverse these organizations have become. Orange County isn't exactly what you'd think of as traditional organized crime territory. It's full of affluent suburban communities, tech companies, and upscale shopping centers. But that's exactly what makes it attractive to criminal enterprises looking to generate revenue and maintain lower profiles. The racketeering operations that Martinez allegedly oversaw represent the modern face of organized crime. Systematic, ongoing criminal enterprises that generate substantial profits while maintaining territorial control and organizational discipline. We're not talking about small-time street crimes here, but sophisticated operations that can involve everything from drug trafficking to financial crimes to corruption of legitimate businesses. The 2017 murder of Robert Rios in Placentia is the kind of violence that federal prosecutors argue is endemic to these criminal organizations. Placentia is a pretty quiet, middle-class community in northern Orange County, not the kind of place where you'd expect organized crime violence. But that's exactly the point. When criminal organizations feel their authority or interests are threatened, geography doesn't matter. The federal case against Martinez represents the Justice Department's continued use of RICO prosecutions to go after entire criminal enterprises rather than just individual crimes. By charging him with racketeering in addition to specific violent crimes, prosecutors can potentially demonstrate the systematic nature of his alleged criminal activities and seek penalties that reflect the comprehensive scope of the enterprise. The murder charges are particularly significant because they involve the federal death penalty, which is about as serious as criminal sanctions get in the American system. The decision to seek capital punishment in organized crime cases reflects both the gravity of the alleged crimes and the government's determination to send a clear message about the consequences of criminal leadership. By April 2025, prosecutors were rethinking whether to push for the death penalty. In federal cases, that decision isn't made lightly. It means weighing the crimes, the person's background, and what justice really calls for. It also taps into the bigger national debate. Does executing someone from an organized crime group actually stop the violence or just turn them into a martyr? The next boss on our list might be the most elusive of them all, because unlike everyone else we've covered, he's still out there, a fugitive giving law enforcement across Europe one massive headache. Giovanni Motisi. Motisi is a Cosa Nostra boss from Palermo, and the charges waiting for him if he's ever captured are absolutely brutal. We're talking about murders including the killing of a police officer, which in Italian law and culture represents not just a crime against an individual, but an attack on the democratic institutions that the officer represented. The fact that he's managed to stay free despite being one of the most wanted men in Italy speaks to both his own survival skills and the support networks that apparently still exist within Sicilian society. Being a successful fugitive in the modern world isn't easy. You need money, safe houses, people willing to risk their own freedom to help you, and the ability to stay completely off the grid in an age of ubiquitous surveillance. The Palermo raids that targeted Motisi, even though they didn't result in his capture, represent the kind of massive law enforcement effort that modern anti-mafia operations require. These raids don't happen overnight. They're the result of months or years of investigation, surveillance, intelligence gathering, and careful coordination between multiple agencies. The fact that Motisi managed to evade capture despite these extensive efforts is honestly pretty impressive from a purely tactical standpoint, even though what he represents is obviously terrible. It suggests that he either has incredible operational security or access to intelligence about law enforcement activities that allows him to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. The charges that would be waiting for Motisi if he's arrested, mafia association, murder, and racketeering, represent the full spectrum of serious organized crime offenses. The murder charges are particularly significant given that they allegedly include the killing of a police officer, which under Italian law carries special weight and typically results in the harshest possible penalties. The fact that he's still free says a lot about how hard it is to take down organized crime. Chasing a fugitive like this isn't a quick job. It eats up manpower, tech, and money for years on end. Next up, Francesco Domingo. As a member of the Villa Grazia di Carini clan operating in the Palermo area, Domingo was allegedly involved in the kind of systematic criminal activity that forms the backbone of these organizations' power and influence. The Villa Grazia di Carini clan might not be as famous as some of the other Cosa Nostra families, but that doesn't make them any less significant in terms of the overall organizational structure. These regional clans serve crucial roles in maintaining territorial control, generating revenue, and providing the organizational infrastructure infrastructure that allows the broader criminal enterprise to function effectively. According to prosecutors, Domingo was managing extortion and protection rackets, which are basically the bread and butter of how these organizations maintain control over their territories. This isn't just about demanding money from local businesses, it's about creating a comprehensive system of control that touches virtually every aspect of economic activity in their areas of influence. The protection rackets that figures like Domingo allegedly operate create a vicious cycle that's incredibly difficult to break. Businesses that pay protection money become dependent on the criminal organization for security, while those that refuse face harassment, vandalism, or worse. This system creates a parallel economy where legitimate businesses are forced to operate according to criminal rules rather than market forces. Domingo wasn't just dabbling in crime. Prosecutors say he was part of a coordinated push to rebuild the Mafia's power structure in Sicily. This was about more than individual thugs making money. It was a calculated effort to restore the networks and territories that once let Cosa Nostra dominate the island. His arrest came after months of surveillance, financial tracking, and likely tips from inside the organization. The charges, mafia association and extortion, may sound less sensational than murder, but they're the lifeblood of the mafia, the everyday crimes that keep its grip on power and cash flowing. Another key player from the Casalesi clan, Antonio Iovine, is proof that these criminal organizations can keep their grip on power, even when their leaders are supposedly taken down by the justice system. Antonio Iovine. Iovine's story is particularly fascinating because it shows how criminal enterprises can maintain operational capacity through networks of loyalty and fear that extend far beyond any single individual. Iovine was one of those Camorra bosses who understood that real power in organized crime isn't just about violence, it's about creating systems of control that can operate independently of any single leader. The Casalesi clan, under figures like Iovine and Bidognetti, wasn't just a criminal organization, it was basically a shadow state that had its own economy, its own justice system, and its own methods of maintaining order and discipline. What made Iovine particularly dangerous was his understanding of how to blend legitimate business activities with criminal enterprises in ways that made detection and prosecution incredibly difficult. The Casalesi clan, under his influence, operated construction companies, waste management firms, and various other businesses that provided both cover for criminal activities and legitimate revenue streams that could be used to fund expansion and corruption. Like Bidognetti, Iovine also found himself entangled in the 2008 courtroom intimidation incident involving threats against Roberto Saviano and Rosaria Capacchione. His connection to this case through the lawyer Michele Santonastaso demonstrates the coordinated nature of the Camorra's efforts to silence critics and maintain their traditional code of silence and intimidation. The fact that multiple high-level Casalesi figures were involved in orchestrating threats against journalists and authors shows just how seriously these organizations take the threat posed by public exposure of their activities. For groups that depend on operating in the shadows and maintaining public fear and silence, investigative journalism and anti-mafia literature represent existential threats that must be countered at all costs. Iovine's case also demonstrates the long-term nature of organized crime prosecutions and the patience required to build comprehensive cases against sophisticated criminal enterprises. The investigation and prosecution processes that eventually led to accountability for the 2008 intimidation incident required sustained effort over nearly 2 decades, involving multiple agencies and legal jurisdictions. The charges that figures like Iovine face in connection with mafia association and intimidation represent broader efforts by Italian authorities to target not just individual criminal acts, but the systematic nature of these organizations and their methods of maintaining power and control. These prosecutions recognize that organized crime is not just about specific violations of law, but about the creation and maintenance of parallel power structures that undermine democratic institutions. Iovine's story, like that of his fellow Casalesi bosses, shows just how hard it is for democracies to crush organized crime without crossing legal lines. It's a constant tightrope walk, hitting these networks hard enough to break them, while still protecting the rights and due process that the justice system is built on. Closing out our list is Sedmo Mineo. This guy Sedmo was a veteran Cosa Nostra boss whose life shows how the mafia survives generation after generation. Arrested in 2018, he was eventually released before 2025, and prosecutors say he wasted no time slipping back into the same rackets that landed him behind bars in the first place. Mineo isn't just another criminal, he's part of the mafia's living memory. These organizations aren't loose crews, they're institutions with traditions, rules, and hard-earned knowledge passed down like family heirlooms. When a figure like Mineo Mineo walks free, he brings decades of experience and a Rolodex of connections that can help stitch a battered criminal empire back together. According to prosecutors, Mineo was allegedly involved in facilitating extortion and drug trafficking activities, while also playing a role in the broader cupola rebuilding efforts that law enforcement was working so hard to prevent. The cupola, as we've discussed before, represents the governing structure that coordinates between different Cosa Nostra families and helps prevent destructive internal conflicts. The fact that veteran figures like Mineo were allegedly willing to risk their remaining years of freedom to participate in these rebuilding efforts suggests just how deeply ingrained the criminal lifestyle and organizational loyalty are within these communities. For someone who had already served time and experienced the consequences of criminal activity, the decision to get involved again represents either incredible dedication to the organization or a complete inability to imagine life outside of it. Mineo's alleged facilitation of extortion and drug trafficking represents the kind of behind-the-scenes coordination that's crucial to these organizations' operations. While younger members might be involved in the day-to-day activities of collecting protection money or moving drugs, veteran figures like Mineo provide the strategic thinking and organizational connections that make these activities possible on a larger scale. On the surface, mafia association and extortion might sound like standard charges, but in Mineo's case, they speak volumes. They point to a carefully structured criminal network where every figure has a role, and to the fact that even in old age, a seasoned boss can still shape the direction of the organization. These accusations are as much about his legacy as they are about his current actions, and that's a wrap. If you enjoyed this video, check out these other ones on your screen right now. Thanks for watching. Till next time.